right, let's get started. So we are recording. Hopefully I have your permission to do so. I would like to introduce Dr. Gabi Bell Jiménez. She is the K-5 Director of Curriculum and Instruction for Literacy, Biliteracy, English Language Development, and Intervention in the Madison Metropolitan School District, which is located in Madison, Wisconsin. My name is Jeanette Russell. I am a board member of the Reading League. I will be here to co-pilot and help Gabi with the chat and answer any other questions. So thank you, Dr. Gabi Bell Jiménez, for being here with us, and go ahead and take it away.
Absolutely. First and foremost, thank you for each and every one of you for your generosity of time. Like, time is an unknowable resource, and you have selected to spend a little bit of time this afternoon with us, and we are so grateful. And I thank you so much for your leadership and partnership in helping us through this conversation. So Gabi Bell Jiménez, and as Janet said, I serve as the Director of Curriculum and Instruction in the Madison Metropolitan School District. This accent is completely real. I am an adult English language learner. I started on my journey of English proficiency nearing my 20th birthday. So a lot of my passion for this work is connected to a really personal life story. I have children who are multilingual learners, and I continue to feel so blessed and so grateful for the opportunity to serve all students, but really thinking today with a great amount of specificity for English language learners and multilingual learners. Oh, we have people coming in. So exciting. Okay. So this is the conversation that we're going to have today. So we're going to play it like if we were getting on a plane. I want to be absolutely certain that I am meeting your expectations. The objective for today is to engage in a conversation about some nuance and specificity for science of reading. And through the conversation, really talking about some things that we have believed to be true related to the ways in which we serve English language learners and how we see the science and research are moving us in other directions. So many of you are in your preparation programs, then maybe your teacher prep programs are already pointing you in the right place or in the right way, and that is what we're expecting, and that is what we want to expand for us today. There are some really unique challenges about English language learners, and I am going to count on you, and I'm going to invite you to unmute yourselves for specific parts of the presentation to elevate your voice and to share with us how is it that you're experiencing some of the things that we are going to be talking about. Okay. So I think that an important entry point for the conversation is to operationalize the object of study. Okay. So there are many ways in which we name persons in the United States, particularly, that are between K-12 public schools that are speakers of more than one language. So multilingual learners is a term that we have been using for the last decade or so to talk about students who are developing proficiency in more than one language. So multilingual learners is quite a large umbrella that it really is any student who is developing more than one language. Most multilingual learners are part of educational programs that are typically called bilingual programs or two-way bilingual immersion programs or dual language immersion programs. Like, all of those names fall into this category. By the year 2021 in the United States, we have over 3,600 of these types of programs. And in 11 out of the 50 states, we have legislation that point states to open bilingual education of some sort if they meet a minimal threshold. So you can see here in the slide how I have listed for you the 11 states that have, that meet the requirement. Wisconsin is one of the states. If we have an X number of students that share a common home language, that attend the same physical building within a specific grade level band, I am legally bound to offer a type of bilingual education. Some bilingual education is additive, which means that it's going to foster the development of the home language and add English. And some of them are subtractive. Some bilingual education programs are providing instruction in the home language only long enough until the point that we can flip into English only instruction. There's also states within the United States that prohibit bilingual education. What is the important takeaway here as we contextualize the conversation today is that even though only 11 states have legislation that mandate bilingual education, 44 states report having this type of education. So we may have students that are multilingual learners in a wide variety of programming. Most of them are going to be receiving bilingual education, okay? Now, English language learners is another term that we use, and English language learner is really about the students who are in the process of becoming English proficient. And the term English language learner is a very important term because it's that term that the federal government uses to identify the students that are in this trajectory. So English language learners are multilingual learners in bilingual programs. So a native Spanish speaker in a dual language immersion program, receiving instruction in Spanish and in English, for example, is a multilingual learner because he's learning to read in two languages, but it's also an English language learner because that student is receiving an identification from the federal government about that is connected to their journey of becoming proficient in English, okay? Now, there are some important characteristics about English language learners in our communities. One that has shifted since 1999 when I started in education and today is that today most English language learners in the United States are born in the United States. So these are babies, these are children in our schools who have benefited from a home language. Overwhelmingly, the vast majority of English language learners in the United States are Spanish speakers, and they have a home language and they're bringing that language when they are entering our schools. So a little bit of context: in the state of Wisconsin, we serve in 2021, we serve about 850,000 students, and of those about 850,000 students and about 50,000 were English language learners for us in our public schools. So I'm going to invite you to unmute yourself. You have heard me talk for about 7 minutes now. Do you primarily serve multilingual learners in bilingual programs, or do you overwhelmingly serve English language learners, or do you serve both? If you would like to unmute yourself and just share with us, which one do you have? Multilingual learners, so people that learn to read and write in two languages, or do you have English language learners that are only learning in English but are bringing their home language into the school?
I'll start us off. This is Teresa, and I am from Arkansas, where bilingual education is prohibited. And so I have about a third of my students who are English language learners, but they're not receiving other language education in the school system.
Perfect. Okay. And what grade levels do you serve, my dearest?
7th and 8th graders.
7th and 8th graders. I love middle schoolers. Thank you for sharing. Anyone else that would like to share their context?
I can share. That's fine. I work in Wisconsin actually, but I only serve English language learners because we don't have in our district a population that constitutes needing a bilingual program. So we have
The threshold.
Yeah, we have about 40 languages within our district and about 150 English language learners. And so I serve K-12 in 3 buildings, and then I have a counterpart who serves K-12 in 3 other buildings.
Oh, wow. And was this Samantha, Jane?
Yes.
Samantha, which district are you in?
I work in New Berlin.
Nice.
Yes, our population has really grown.
Yes, that is wonderful. Anyone else that would like to, we'll take one more to learn about your context? My wait time is pretty good because I'm a teacher, but I will move forward because we have quite a bit of content to move through. Okay, thank you so much for sharing a little bit of your context. It is super, super important. I think that a fundamental question that we must ask ourselves when trying to engage in decision making about English language learners and multilingual learners is first and foremost, what is the program model? So understanding if we're doing ESL or English as a second language or English language development versus bilingual education or alongside bilingual education is a very, very important distinction. So this is the proposal for the agenda today. I would like to engage in a brief conversation about instructional frameworks and talk about this idea of like there's two sister frameworks that we should always consider when we're talking about multilingual learners and English language learners, and then talk about word recognition and language comprehension as their own variables and some myths, some misconceptions, some ways in which this research is pulling us forth, and some instructional recommendations. Is the agenda agreeable to you? Can you give me a thumbs up if it is? Some thumbs up. Thank you, thank you, thank you. All right, moving right along. All right, I am all about elegant frameworks. I am not going to spend a lot of time talking about the simple view of reading because you are in a reading league event. So I know that you know about this very important and elegant way of thinking about reading comprehension that explains our ability to read for meaning when two variables are interacting with each other, right? Like the word recognition times the language comprehension, and how it is that it is not an addition, but either a multiplication, a way in which these two interact, then we can actually enjoy and lift from a text its implicit and explicit meaning. There is another framework that we hardly ever speak of when we are talking about multilingual learners or English language learners. And I would like to spend a minute here. And I have to name that I was introduced to systemic functional linguistics through a partnership and mentorship of Dr. Roslana Westerland, who is very, very important to all of us that are in school districts that use the WIDA framework. And it is through her partnership that I got to understand that there was a way in which language was being thought about through systemic functional linguistics specifically, and that is the functional approach of language development. And the functional approach of language development says the following. It says that language learners have a very large language inventory structure. That means that as a bilingual person, every time that I interact in either one of the languages that I speak and read and write in, I am experiencing the phonology of the language, but I have many ways in which I can represent how the language is encoded. Or I have many ways in which the syntax can be organized because I have access to a very large inventory connected to it. The other component of the functional approach of language development says that language is first and foremost a meaning-making resource. That means that when I am learning a language or developing a language, or when I have access of more than one language to connect with other people, or to learn in school, or to be at work with other humans, or to connect with the community at large, that my primary objective of using language is to make meaning. This is very, very important because sometimes when we're working with English language learners or with multilingual learners, we want to get to the very technical level, but we have to understand that the primary reason for language is meaning making, okay? And there are some instructional implications connected to it. The third component, which is like the plate in which the first two sit, says that teachers must focus on what the students need to be able to do with language, right? And then highlight what are the features within the language that they need to be able to do that task. So in school settings, we would ask ourselves the question with language learners: what is it that the student is going to be asked to do with this language that we're using? Is the student going to be asked to narrate, to inform, to argue? What is it that to explain? What is the thing that the student is going to be asked to do? And what are the linguistic features within narration or the informative component or the explanation? What are the specific features connected to that the student needs in order to be able to get there? Okay. So a way to think about these two frameworks interacting is that the word recognition component can be explained in multilingual learners by these very, very, very large inventories that we have. Okay, so could you, if we could have two more friends unmute themselves and share with us what are some of the home languages that their multilingual learners or their English language learners speak at? What are some of their home language? We will take two.
We have Spanish and Mandarin.
And who was that, Deshe?
This is Christina Jimenez.
Oh, hi, Christina. And where are you serving?
I'm actually in Seattle Public
You're
Schools.
actually in Seattle. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you.
One more person that would like to share.
I can share. I work in Illinois. Most of our multilingual learners speak Spanish as their heritage language, but we also have several students from India who Malayalam is their heritage language. And then we have about 19 other countries represented in our district.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing. In Madison, where I am serving, we have a little over 100 languages spoken. Overwhelmingly, our English language learners are Spanish speakers, so they sound a lot like me, but we see this connection between the large inventory and word recognition. So let me share with you some of the ways in which we can have, that we can make meaning of these specific linguistic structures for English language learners. As we have shared, we have many spoken languages, and it is unlikely that we're ever going to have a staff member that are speakers of all of those languages. One thing that can be gleaned from the word recognition component for English language learners is the importance of understanding phonology as the entry point for that part of the variable. So something that would behoove us to understand when we're talking about word recognition for multilingual learners and English language learners is which of the phonemes within their home language actually exist in English, and in what ways do they exist. So, for example, are the sounds in the home, are some of the sounds in the home language exactly represented like in the way that we use it in English? That will be a positive transfer. Do we have sounds that only exist in one language, or do we have sounds that have a close enough representation, but that are not exactly the same? So understanding the phonology of the home language as a way to have an entry point into English when we're working on word recognition is super important. So Dr. Elsa Cardenas shares in some of her work that she uses, and she recommends the use of mylanguages.org. So at the end of the presentation for the attendance certificate, I will be sure to share with you a one-pager that is going to have some resources. The link for mylanguages.org is going to be there. And the way in which I recommend colleagues to use it is to go into the platform and then look for the section titled Alphabet, and then make sense of the phonemic awareness that is attached to that language, and then make sense of that. In addition, once we understand the connection at the phonological level, thinking and working explicitly for articulation is very important, because the way in which multilingual learners and English language learners make sense at the articulation standpoint is really going to support them and move them forward into being able to encode in a way that makes sense as it relates to the classic or the standard way in which English is being perceived when we are doing the encoding. A question that I am often asked, and a curiosity that often people have as it relates to English language learners and newcomers, is who is best positioned to be able to deliver core instruction for word recognition? And I think that the answer needs to come from within the places where the students are being served. And we need to ask ourselves whether or not there is a belief system within the organization that multilingual learners and English language learners are first and foremost Tier 1 students, right? So in what ways do the specialists, the ESL and the BRTs can support the classroom teacher when the classroom teacher is delivering powerful, systemic word recognition instruction and making the inventories visible for students? So I was thinking that for language learning, language is the most important resource. So if we want students to develop their language, we need to seek for them to be in places where the most rigorous and the most rich language occurs. And it is often that very rich language and that rich instruction is happening with a standards aligned curriculum along grade level tiers. So the considerations for word recognition stay within those constructions, because we want the students to be able to benefit from all the conversation, all the contextualization, and all of the rigor of Tier 1 instruction as they are able to access the entire pathway of learning. Of course, with the support of someone, this can be the classroom teacher, this can be an ESL or a BRT, that makes visible how the home language is supporting them in understanding, or how is it that through constructive analysis we're saying this is a place or this is a sound that might be new for you because you are acquiring English at this point. Do you have any questions, wonderings, or inquiries connected to this idea of making sense of the student's home language to make visible which structures should be highlighted so then they can continue to accelerate in their attainment of word recognition? Hearing none, I will move forward. Another structure that makes a lot of sense and is really, really important to make visible for students. We just said that phonology is an imperative, is a really important entry point for students. Syllable types and syllable structures are also very important for English language learners. What is this? Because every single spoken language have its own way to identify and organize syllables, and there are syllable types that are of highest utility. So understanding syllable types and making visible for students syllable division, what are the limits of a syllable and what are the specific structures of a syllable, as it is a combination of consonant and vowels, and which combinations of consonant and vowels make sense. Sometimes it's a step that we miss, right? Sometimes we just go through it because sometimes we fail to understand that the student might be coming from a place of understanding or a language that is structuring the words in a different way. So thinking about what is the program type is very important for this, because if the multilingual learner or the English language learner are in an English only classroom or receiving ESL only or English language development, this level of explanation about syllable structures is really important in English. But if the multilingual learner or the English language learner is part of bilingual education, the conversation about syllable types is really, really important in each of the languages in which the student is expected to learn to read and write. This is a bit of a point of contention or a point of tension or a myth connected to multilingual learners in bilingual programs. There have been historical ways of structuring bilingual programming that have required or asked for school districts to hold off to the explicit teaching of English literacy for multilingual learners and English language learners in bilingual programs until later into their academic life. So in bilingual programs, in dual language immersion programs, if you look at historical documents that have been printed, they would indicate that the targeted language should be the only explicit language of instruction on the onset. So in kindergarten, first, second grade, all the formal literacy should acquire in the partner language. The partner language could be Spanish, could be Hmong, and then you introduce English later on. What research is telling us right now is that the human brain is perfectly capable to learn to read and write and to speak in more than one language, so long we intentionally teach that child to be able to do that. So the capacity of the multilingual learner or the English language learner to learn to read and write in more than one language depends on our ability to systemically predict for the student access to daily instruction in that language. As I have done research on this topic as to when and how do we structure literacy in bilingual programs, I have come to understand that overwhelmingly the recommendation to wait to instruct in English until later grades was connected to a philosophical belief that if the language learners learn to read in English, they would not want to read in Spanish, because at the time that these publications came about in the 80s, in the very early 90s, it was very difficult to find text in Spanish. So the sociopolitical context have moved, and neuroscience is pointing us to a place of understanding in which if you teach to read and write in both languages, the kiddos are going to learn to be able to do that, so long we do it in a way that is systemic, okay? I'm gonna pause here in case that anyone has any wonderings or any reactions or any thoughts about this part. Okay, I'm moving right along. Data collection and analysis. Data collection and analysis for word recognition for multilingual learners or English language learners needs to be completely connected to the program type. If your multilingual learners and or English language learners are in an English-only program, there are benefits of you knowing what is it that the student knows and is able to do in their home language as a way of you to be able to make sense as to how to move forward education, even if it is in English only. However, it is unlikely that school districts are going to have all the resources necessary to be able to evaluate students always in their home language. Furthermore, it's going to be, it's less likely yet, or even that even if you are able to collect the data, that you are going to be able to have in-house people with the linguistic expertise to be able to make sense of a lot of it. So program type is important for English language learners in English only programs. Do try your best to know what is it that the students are able to do, because all of the languages contribute and are connected, even though we're using specific pathways for specific languages in the brain, and use the data to be able to make sense of how tier 1 is for the students. I strongly encourage you to collect universal screener data on English language learners. For many, many years in bilingual education or English language development education, we created district level policies that protected or excluded English language learners from having to do universal screeners because they did not have enough oral proficiency. The fact of the matter is that the universal screeners will give us data about the students, even if they don't have a high English oracy. The important thing is the way in which we analyze the data. So when we're analyzing data for English language learners, on literacy specifically, we need to look at the data in light of their language proficiency data that the students have. So if I am looking at my universal screeners in English, for example, I will be looking at what is my language proficiency data and making sense between both of those resources to then be able to plan for tier 1 instruction. Okay. So I am looking at the clock and it's 7:02, so I'm going to move swiftly into the language comprehension and thinking about language as a meaning-making tool. So you can see now how I have circled the 2 other components within both of the frameworks. Now I have the language comprehension and I have language as a meaning-making tool. Clicking here. It is of critical importance that we, once again, are grounded into the understanding that for language learners, the most important resource is language. It is the most important resource. You can have really, really good curriculum that is standards aligned. You can have teachers that are licensed. You can have the best dispositions. You can have staff that is trained on science of reading, but if students are not given ample opportunities to engage in language, all of those efforts are going to be minimized because they don't have access to language as a resource. So this is a way in which I think about it. Or this is minimally a way in which I explain the shift from scaffolds and or simplification of language into amplification of language and acceleration. Think about an 18-month-old, a 20-month-old that is learning how to walk. Our reaction when the kiddo takes the first step is that we clear the space for the baby to be able to take as many steps as possible in a way that is safe. Language is like that. When we are developing language, what is most important in educational environments is that we feel safe enough and that we're loved enough, that we're able to take the risk of taking the first step, and that you allow us as much time as possible in that language, and you don't interrupt us until we stop making meaning. So allowing a student or allowing the students to engage in the struggle of language production is exactly what we want to see, and that's exactly what we want happening. And we will only interact or would create social contracts in which students and peers will only interact when meaning is no longer happening. If I no longer know what you are saying, I am going to pause. I'm going to ask for questions. I'm going to give you an opportunity to restate. So thinking about language as the most important resource is of high importance. This requires a philosophical shift, as I said, from simplification of language and scaffolding. I was trained and I got my first teaching license in 1999. And in 1999, the pedagogies that I had my first license on, that was an ESL license, was about language simplification. It was like students come with little English. So what we need to do is to make English as simple as possible so then they can attach to it. And then we're going to teach them step by step by step by step. What research is telling us right now is that English language learning requires language development. And language is developed if we have really rich structures and language generative structures to be able to do that. So this doesn't seem like a big thing, but it causes quite a bit of philosophical dissonance for team members and for staff members that have studied explicitly language development and have, for example, an ESL license. Depending on when in time and where geographically they got their license, they might have been trained on simplification of language. And what research is pointing us to do is acceleration of language. So rather than simplify, amplify. Because it is in the amplification that as language learners, we have more places where we can grab on and make meaning from. Okay? Now you might be asking, what are some structures that can help amplification of language? So in the research that we are going to share, I will be linking a couple articles. One of these is on language abundancy, another jewel that I received from Dr. Roslana Westerland. And the strategy is, or the trick is on ensuring that the pedagogical practices that we're engaging with for language learners are language generative. So there are practices that are going to provide students, English language learners or multilingual learners, with an entry point, and then are going to require for them to generate language as they are doing that. I'm going to pause here before I go into some detail about each of these to see if the conversation about simplification and acceleration of language is something for which you have any reactions or any thoughts or wonderings. I will take all your ideas. Okay. All right. Do read the article because I think that you will really enjoy it. Okay. So these are some of the strategies and some of the ways in which we can support English language learners to engage in using language and developing their language. One of them is chunking information. So a way of chunking information when we are using grade level rigorous text is by providing clarity to the multilingual learners or the English language learners about what is the objective or the task that is going to be required of them at the end of the specific reading. So let's say that you are reading Percy Jackson and the Lion Thief. That's an entire text, right? But today, in your class, in your 7th grade class, you are going to be reading 4 paragraphs on a chapter. You could read the 4 paragraphs on a chapter and wait to the end of the read aloud, activity to ask your questions. Or you could ask the entire class, and this will benefit the English language learners, and saying, we are going to read these 4 chapters from Percy Jackson and the Lion Thief. But as we're reading, I want you to think specifically about how this X character is reacting in relationship to the plot of the story. By doing that, I am giving the English language learners the opportunity to be able to understand the backdrop of the story. And at the same time, I am cueing them and I'm suggesting to their psyche, and quite frankly, the psyche of the entire class, about what it is that I am going to ask. And that level of chunking is really going to support English language learners and multilingual learners in being able to generate language for you in a way that is really meaningful. Please know that for this strategy, I did not ask them to get a different version of Percy Jackson, the Lion Thief. I didn't ask them to read less of Percy Jackson, the Lion Thief. I didn't ask them to, it is exactly the same grade level task. But I created an area of emphasis for the class that benefited the English language learners in doing this. Now, let's say that this is not 7th grade and I am working with 1st graders, and this is social studies, and it is the theme of family. And the book that I am reading is The Little Red Hen. I think that's the name of the book in English. But Rosa, is that the name of a book in English, The Little Red Hen? The one that cooks and the other friends don't help her cook, And then
Yep.
the little chick helper, that's the name of the story. Okay. I get the names of the books in English wrong all the time. I was only reading Nursery Rhymes in Spanish, so I apologize if I say the wrong name of the book. So I am reading The Little Red Hen. The kiddos, 80% of them know the story, but I am going to ask them, because I know that the theme for social studies is family. I'm going to say, like, we're going to read The Little Red Hen today. And I want you to listen. We're going to read to understand how it is that the family is supporting the making of the bread. So the kiddos are onto the entire story. They know that there is a fog, that they know that there is some people that are not helping with doing anything about growing the grain so we can make the bread. But you have provided a really clear entry point for the language learner and the multilingual learner to be able to anchor themselves in it. Okay, depending on the age of the student, depending on the program type, and also depending on what is the text and what is the task, you can use a specific, you can use other things, like you can be absolutely certain that they understand which one is the character that they're fighting, that they're following, or if it is on the theme of family, you would have had a conversation about what a family is, how families are different, family structures, right? All these things, because you're building a linguistic schema for the language learners to be able to access that entry point. Chunking information is beneficial to all students, I would argue, but it's essential for language learners. It really, really, really is essential. I, as an adult and an administrator in a professional education, I humbly ask my colleagues to please send me the agenda ahead of time, right? So I know how to prepare myself. So I know exactly what are my entry points connected to it. And I have been a speaker of English for half my life. But making sense of those things are really, really important for all language learners. And I think I'm quite proficient, but still, like, we need that. The strategic use of visuals is one that is often overused and sometimes it's misused. So let me tell you a little bit about this one. I'm going to use a nice statement. In 1999, when I got my teaching license, I was told that it was really, really, really important for me to teach key vocabulary and that I needed to select what were the keywords in the text and I needed to make them visible for students before we engage in the reading. And I was told that this is fundamental for English language learners because otherwise they're not going to be able to make sense of anything about the text. And some of those things are true, but some of those things are not so true. One of the things that is of critical importance when selecting vocabulary and then using visuals to be able to make sense of them is understanding the philosophical why of the text. When you ask yourself, first and foremost, why is it that of all the texts in all the world and all the instructional minutes that I will ever have with this student, I have selected to use this text? Why this text? Understanding the why of the text is going to reveal to you what is the key vocabulary that the student needs to know. Okay? Sometimes the key vocabulary is not explicitly in the text. Now you're wondering, like, now she has my attention. What is she talking about? So I taught middle school and I taught high school. So and I of course have taught elementary school, but let me use an example from 9th grade. We typically read in 9th grade, The Man in the Well. Can you give me a thumbs up if you have ever read The Man in the Well? Have any of you ever read The Man in the Well? No? Okay, you're gonna read it after this. So The Man in the Well is this extraordinary short story that was published in 1985. It was published in Illinois. I will add it to our resources. And it's a short story that takes place in the 1950s, 1960s in the Midwest, very flat land. And this group of about 7 to 11-year-olds are running in the fields playing, and they hear someone screaming. And they run to hear, to find out where is it that the screaming is coming from. And they realize that somebody have dug a well and there's a man in it. And the man looks at them and he's like, oh, I'm so grateful you found me. Can you please go home and let your parents know that I'm here? So the kids are like, sure. They start running, and as they're heading back home, one of them says, what if we don't tell anybody? What if we don't tell anybody? And they decide not to tell anyone. It's a really extraordinary story. And the why of the story in 9th grade is conformity, is groupthink. The reason why I want the students to engage with the text is to engage in a conversation, engage in a dialogue about a very large, important idea in adolescence about groupthink and about conformity. Are you satisfied with following a normative, even if you feel uneasy personally? So the key vocabulary for the text, the one thing that I needed, the one word that I needed the students, the one idea I needed the students to be able to engage with as language learners into the text was this idea of conformity. So rather than having a slide deck that says conformity, this is what it means, these are some examples, these are some non-examples, I use visuals strategically. I found a whole bunch of pictures that show different facets of conformity, and we engage in an activity. When I say, I'm going to show you this picture and I want you to write in a post-it what you think it is. All the pictures are on the same theme. So we show the picture and then we engage in a conversation. We show another picture, and then the more picture that I show them, the more schema that they were building, the more language that they were generating. It is likely that at the end of the activity, I'm going to have to say the name of this thing that you're talking about in English is conformity. And then I engage into the full thing of saying, this is how you spell conformity. This is how many syllables are in conformity. These are examples of how you use conformity, right? But I use visuals in a way that was generating language because I have selected really, really well what was the concept connected to the why for it. I would argue this, once again, is a great activity for all students. No child will be harmed in doing this, but it's fundamental. It's of critical importance for English language learners because you're allowing us to enter the space and engage in a conversation that is rich enough, that is interesting enough, that is going to, invite us to take the risk. And B, you are really helping us build a schema, and you're suggesting to our psyche. So as we're reading the text, we know that something is going to happen that is connected to that. Now imagine if I tier the strategies. I use visuals strategically on the onset, and then I'm also going to chunk information. So when I start reading the text, I'm going to say, for the first 2 paragraphs, we're going to read to understand who are the characters. How is it that the characters are being introduced? For the next 2 paragraphs, we're going to engage in a conversation about how is it that the plot is developing, right? So you can mix and use the strategies connected to each other. Experiences and realia are really, really important for language learners. It's really hard for us to be able to fully engage in a conversation about an object for which we have no experiences, or if we're not certain if we have experiences. Sometimes we have experiences about something, but our language proficiency gets on the way. I am going to be vulnerable here as an adult English language learner and say that many years ago, when I was a baby teacher, I remember having a colleague in the teacher lounge saying that in their town there was a fairy. And I was a preschool teacher, and there's a lot of conversations about fairies in preschool. And for a minute, even though I was an adult and I knew that there were no fairies per se, the conversation about having a fairy in a town really threw me for a loop. And it took me about 90 seconds to understand that the fairy that they were talking about was this thing that was on water where you put cars and the cars moved. It was not like the fairies that my heroes were talking about. So this idea of experiences and realia when we're talking about something that is really specific is very helpful. So use that, right? And create environments in which language learners and multilingual learners feel fine being vulnerable enough and saying, like, which fairy are you talking about, right? Because that is how bilingual minds work. Paraphrasing is important, and it is crucial when the paraphrasing is not coming always from the teacher. You want the paraphrasing to be something that students engage with. So remember when I said that language is the highest and the most vetted resource for language development? So imagine that a student is engaging in communicating with you, and then you break communication. Like, you are letting them walk like the toddlers walk, and they get to a point where like, no, communication is broken. I no longer understand what is happening. Asking students to tell you more about what they're saying. Try a different way of saying it until you can gain understanding is a way of paraphrasing. Okay, you can use it also as a teacher, but it's really powerful when we teach students to do it with each other. I'm gonna have a little bit of water. I'm sorry, I get excited about this. Contextualizing the text is super important. And the takeaway for this strategy for language development is to train our instructional selves to look into the text to understand the meaning of the text. For language learners and multilingual learners, we are tempted. If we have a text that is grade level rigorous and say like, oh, this is going to be really hard, I'm going to look for all of these other texts for them to understand this one. There is great value in looking at the text to understand the text, because the text tells us always implicitly and explicitly what it's trying to say. So if we are aiming for students to engage in grade level rigor, the strategy of contextualizing within the text is very, very, very important. I would use an example for 4th grade. We were reading The Little Prince from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. Have any of you read The Little Prince? Give me a thumbs up. I will tell you really quickly. The Little Prince from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry is one of the most beloved short novels written in French. And it is about this pilot that lands in the Sahara Desert in the time of like World War II or within the decade. And one day, like his plane is broke, so he thinks he's gonna die. This is it. And one day, out of the blues, this little boy that he calls the Little Prince shows up. And the Little Prince takes him into a philosophical journey to understand adulthood and humanity. And one of the things that the Little Prince does is that he finds a fox, and all the creatures speak in the book. And the Little Prince needs a friend. And he tells the fox, can you be my friend? I need a friend. And the fox says, if you want me to be your friend, you need to tame me. Right? And I remember having the urge as a teacher to say, oh my goodness, this is going to be really, really hard. We're going to have to explain to the kiddos all about taming. I'm going to get all my books about the zoo and all the things. The fact of the matter is that the answer of the text was in it. What the fox was asking of the Little Prince was to develop a relationship and engage with him until they were comfortable enough that they could be friends and they could be vulnerable with each other. The answer about the text was in the text. So with language learners, with multilingual learners, finding the hidden and the explicit meaning of the text inside of it is of great value. Because if we don't do that, we are often simplifying and looking for texts that are of lesser rigor to be able to make meaning of that. Really quickly, demonstrated or acting like total physical response. That is a really basic one, but it makes a lot of sense. This is wonderful for building breadth of vocabulary. So the difference between jogging and running and sprinting, right? Like acting these things on the same verb, which is moving from one place to the other one in a way that is fast, are great ways to enhance the student's vocabulary and have fun. And why not be fit while we are doing our work? And of course, connecting to prior knowledge. I am not going to spend a lot of time on that one because that is one that you know. Data collection and analysis for language comprehension. Once again, completely connected to the program type. Collect data for language comprehension in English if the students are in ESL programs, but if the students are in bilingual programs, it is of critical importance that you are connecting data not only on word recognition, but always on language comprehension. Because at the end of the day, that is the goal of the programs, is that the students are bilingual and biliterate if they are in DLI program types or in bilingual program types. I'm going to pass it over to Jeanette with 3 minutes to spare.
Thank you, Dr. Gabby. Thank you so much for providing us with tons of rich information. I want to share our social media page with everyone. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter. We also have our conference coming up, Turning the Tide, in October, on October 4th. So that's coming very soon. And I want to give you all some time to ask questions. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat for Gabby, or feel free to come off mute before
Yes.
I go ahead and put in our certificate of attendance in the chat. So I'm going to pause for just a moment so you all can look at our social media. And then also if you have questions.
I do have a question. When you're doing error analysis on students' writings and you suspect that the syntax or the spelling might be coming from the home language, is your intervention going to be the same intervention you would do for a child who is an ELL or not an ELL? Like, are those tier 2 strategies that you get as a response to your error analysis, are they going to serve your ELL kids just as well? Or do you need to kind of educate yourself on a different kind of intervention when the home language is the source of the error in English?
I think that is a great question. The first inquiry that I would ask is, what is the program type that the student is in, to see how far or how much of the home language information I need to be able to incorporate in order to be able to make sense of it. So let's say that I am running an encoding inventory, true story, and I am assessing where is it that the kiddos are in iris phases, okay? And I am noticing that the student is a Spanish speaker, home language speaker, and that they are using, or the way that in which they're encoding the short vowel U is atypical, right? Like they are encoding it in a way that is not typical for the native English speakers. So understanding the student home language as an entry point into the intervention is important, specifically because for a native English speaker, we could often assume that the students owned the phonology for it, but for the multilingual learner, you need to ensure that the phonology is known to them and that the articulation is known to them. Because it could be that they don't need an intervention. What they need is core instruction to explicitly name or explicitly connect how we say that a sound is connected to a grapheme in English, and how we say that works inside of a word. Does that make sense? Like you can use the same intervention, but you need to understand and contextualize how is it that the home language is playing in the backdrop of that.
Yes, that makes perfect sense. Thank you so much.
Of course. And send me an email if you like. I could talk for hours about interventions.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
And
Thank
Gabby,
you.
we have a question in the chat. What is an example of a negative transfer from home language to English versus zero transfer?
From a negative transfer. A negative transfer for home, I'm going to use myself. So I have from Spanish to English, I have a negative transfer on the use of the letter H. Because H exists in both of my home language and my second language. But the way in which the the grapheme H exists in both, but the way in which the H works in each language is completely different. The H in English makes a sound and my H in Spanish doesn't make a sound, right? So that is an example of that. A zero transfer is the letter ñ, like the one with a little tilde on top, because that one only exists in one language. So there is a zero transfer. There's non-transferable. So my use of letter ñ has no equivalent in English. I only use the letter ñ in Spanish because it only exists in that language. I would say that there is some close pairings. I think that in English, there are some Italian words that have the GN that kind of sound like it, but it really is a different function. Did I answer that question?
And Gretchen said yes. In the chat, she said yes.
Wonderful. Thank you. That's a great question.
So Gabby, I have one more question that I'm going to read that's in the chat.
Of course.
Where can we find the resources mentioned in this meeting?
I am going to create a one-pager, and because you registered, we have your information, and I will have it, Dr. Russell, to you by noon tomorrow, and then we can share with everyone that registered.
And then also, how often should we progress monitor our MLLs, and what would you suggest as a tool to measure student language proficiency growth?
Language is a very deep variable. It's a very deep construct. So language changes quite naturally in the early stages of language development, and it stays kind of the same in the mid-range if there is no treatment. So, for example, in the state of Wisconsin, we use the access test, and we see how our kiddos in kindergarten, first, second grade, kindergarten through second grade, they meet our ESSA expected growth requirements very easily because they are learning, they're in the initial stages of language development. But by the time that they get to third grade, most kiddos get stuck between an access score of like 3.4, and then they elevate themselves into like a 3.9 or 4.1, and they stay there. And they stay there because what English language learners need in order to be able to move beyond those ranges are really specific things, especially in the writing component of the text, connected to the way in which they encode, and also connected to the way in which they're using sentence structures. So in absence of us teaching explicitly those language structures, for example, are we intentionally teaching English language learners how to progress from a simple sentence to a compound sentence, from a compound sentence to a complex sentence, to a compound complex sentence, and how to write genre-specific paragraphs. In absence of that specific teaching, the kiddos are not going to progress in the writing component of the language proficiency assessment, and because of that, they are not going to be able to continue to progress in their trajectory. The same thing is true about reading. So the writing has the syntax complexity and has the encoding complexity. It's not only about the sentence type, but it's about the student's ability to be able to encode using a spelling that is connected to the standard way in which English is spelled. For English language learners that are Spanish speakers, for example, a pain point are vowel teams. So if we don't teach vowel teams explicitly to English language learners, and we cannot make visible for them the importance of placement of the long vowel inside of a word, locked inside of a syllable in the front of the word or at the end of the word, and the statistical likelihood of the spelling depending on the placement, is unlikely that they're going to learn to do that, especially because there are many ways to spell, for example, long vowel U. But we know that if it's in the beginning of the word, 85% of the times it's going to show up like this. If it's at the end of the word, 70% of the time it's going to show like this. If it is locked into a syllable, it's going to look like this. If we don't make those structures visible for language learners, they will not be able to progress on that. So that was a long way of saying, because the variable is so deep, the sub-test analysis of your state-mandated language proficiency assessment is giving you that information. And that information does have a shelf life of 1 year. If you deeply analyze the sub-skill data, the subset data for listening, speaking, reading, and writing for English language learners, that can intelligently inform your literacy or your biliteracy blocks, because it's a really deep variable. You can attend to a specific components through the year, of course, but the data does have a shelf life that is important. You can, of course, and you should, for word recognition for English language learners, not wait an entire year. You can progress monitor for that at the weekly level. You can assess for students' reading comprehension through reading and writing at the end of every unit of study. That can be every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks. You can assess on the small pieces. For year-to-year data is also very important. So please, please, please leverage the psychometric qualities that come as an assurance of the state legislative assessments for language proficiency, because they're telling you, they're giving you a lot of data.
So Gabby, what tool would you suggest to
For
measure
date,
language
to measure for
growth?
word recognition, I would say look at your core instructional resources to see whether or not they have tools for encoding and decoding that are connected to iris faces. For sure, that is a place. If you're looking at a diagnostic level and to be able to overgeneralize from that, the core multiple measures resource, I'm going to add that to the link, is an extraordinary resource for English, and they have some tools in Spanish as well. And from taking the diagnostic, you can create informal assessments at a week-to-week basis if you're delivering instruction to be able to see how students are progressing on that. So I will add those to the one-pager.
Great. Thank you, Gabby. Thank you for your time, everyone. I just included the certificate of attendance. That link is in the chat. Please click on that link. We have the opportunity to provide 1 continuing education hour. Please click on that link and you'll receive your certificate of attendance later this week or sometime next week via email.
Thank you so much.